Welcome to another episode of China Update, where I provide you guys with the most up-to-date political, economic and geostrategic analysis on the world's number 2 economy. My name is Tony. Let's jump in. Okay, happy Thursday everybody. The housing crisis is the most important ongoing development for the Chinese economy, a major driver of growth for 2 decades, representing anything from 20 to 30% of national GDP. The industry is now going through a painful and bumpy transition. A transition that policymakers so far have not handled very well. Chinese financial media outlet Caixin produced a wonderful report this week looking at the housing sector in 2022. We will discuss parts of this report as well as other relevant updates looking forward to 2023, and then finish the video discussing another major issue: housing affordability. We will notice trends which we have followed closely and anticipated in China Update this last year, most notably the signs of massive de facto nationalization of the property sector. Today's video will entirely be on the housing industry. First of all, the obvious: the housing sector did very poorly in 2022. According to data from IFND, in the first 3 quarters of 2022, the industry took an estimated 0.39 percentage points off GDP growth, compared with an average annual contribution of 0.48 percentage points over the past decade. Sales collapsed in 2022. According to China Real Estate Information Corp data, sales of new homes by the country's 100 biggest real estate developers plunged 41.6% in 2022, year on year. And with this drop in sales, prices retreated as well, though more modestly. And of course, as we remember, there were social issues too. Since July, households angry that their unfinished units had stalled threatened to boycott their mortgage payments until work resumed on them, causing a scare among Beijing policymakers and financial regulators. Jobs were lost as well. Some 100,000 companies operate in the wider housing sector, providing 27 million jobs as the nation's second biggest employer. Headcount shrank by 15% in the first half of 2022 alone among the 28 publicly listed developers that disclose staff levels. By late Q3 and Q4, nervous policymakers in Beijing eased property policies on both the supply and demand side to prevent contagion risks. According to China Real Estate Information Corp last year, local governments in nearly 300 Chinese cities had taken measures to boost housing demand. Even major wealthy cities like Dongguan eased measures. At the national level, the People's Bank of China cut rates. In September, it allowed banks to lower the floor on commercial mortgage interest rates and has injected hundreds of billions of yuan of new funding into the property sector. The big guns came out in November when financial regulators abolished a years-long old ban on developers refinancing on the onshore stock market, a huge help for access to capital. But despite all of this, to date, the policies, especially the weak demand-side ones, have not done much to stabilize the market, let alone revive it. Indeed, according to Guoshang Securities Co., by the end of October, 39 of the 100 largest Chinese developers had sought to postpone debt repayments or had defaulted, with the vast majority of these being in the private sector. Analysts and the market alike are hoping that more government support will come this year, and based on what we heard at the Central Economic Work Conference in Beijing last month, Beijing is willing to do just that. The hope this year is for a soft landing and then tough but at least stable transition and reform. This is of course much easier said than done, but some domestic analysts remain optimistic. Quote, developers will likely report housing sales growth in the second half of next year, as some cities could be out of COVID by June, which would cause people's expectations about their income to improve. End quote. However, as Caixin writes, even with a recovery, 2023 will likely still end up being a turning point for China's $60 trillion real estate market, quote, which is unlikely to return to the glory days of years past. That's because long-term housing demand is expected to gradually decrease and developers will no longer be able to borrow as much as they once could to fund their operations, amassing large on- and off-balance sheet debts. End quote. We should also point out that domestic analysts' definition of what a soft landing is for the housing sector in 2023 would still mean a decline in sales year on year. For example, China Real Estate Information Corp analysts in a report forecast sales in terms of floor space to fall by 5% in 2023. Bank of China economists in a report last week are more pessimistic, anticipating a 10% decline in sales this year. And of course, some analysts do not see a soft landing at all this year. CMB International Capital Corp expects a 30% slump in apartment and house sales this year. This is even worse than the 22% drop we saw during the 2008 financial crisis. Now, during this housing crisis in 2022, as we mentioned, one of the most shocking trends has been the state dominance over the industry. Prejudicial policies in formulation and implementation have meant that state-owned players in the wider industry have been disproportionately protected, while private players have been left out in the cold. Quote, China's property sector is effectively being nationalized, with the market share of private developers plunging from 70% before the crisis to somewhere between 10 and 20% over the next 3 years. End quote. While few will shed tears for private developers going bust due to greedy speculation, this state dominance of the sector is not healthy for economic dynamism going forward either. We should also point out that years of policy apathy, and in many instances straight-up policy collusion, artificially maintained a prolonged market boom, creating a systemic environment where only the most aggressively speculative private actors survived, and more measured and conservative players could not compete. As such, it is not the case that the private Chinese property sector is naturally too speculative, but rather that policy created an environment where only aggressive speculators could survive. In a healthier, well-operating free market downturns would wash out the poor risk-takers and reward the more prudent actors. Now, going back to this idea of a soft landing in 2023, even if policymakers were able to manage such a soft landing, most analysts agree the housing market and property sector is not going back to the pre-crisis growth. The era of rapid housing development in China is over. On Sunday at an event, the former finance minister, Lou Jiwei, told the audience just this, that the real estate sector is in the process of definancialization and, quote, it is impossible to return to the old ways. End quote. The Caixin analysts write that the main reason for this is clear. Quote, first, housing demand is likely reaching an inflection point as China's urbanization slows and its population begins to decline. End quote. Indeed, in the previously mentioned Bank of China report, the analysts estimate that annual new housing demand over the next 10 years will be 1.2 billion square meters at best, 20% lower than the annual average of more than 1.5 billion square meters from 2018 through 2021. Quote, second, even if financing restrictions on the property sector are relaxed, developers will no longer have the same easy access to financing as they once had, as market participants, developers, financial institutions, households, and local governments have already accumulated a debt mountain related to real estate. End quote. Okay, next up, the other elephant in the room, housing affordability. Hey guys, if you enjoyed the episode, don't forget to hit that like button. Unfortunately, recently, some subscribers have been unsubscribed by YouTube, so if you think you should be subscribed, it may be worth checking that now. And as always, anyone who can go that extra mile and help me keep the channel sustainable, be part of the community that keeps China Update going, it's just me making these episodes, Patreon and Buy Me a Coffee links are in the description below. As always, thank you so much everybody for the ongoing support. Now, while we're here on the housing crisis, I wanted to also briefly touch on a similar theme, the issue of housing affordability. The modest decline in home prices this year has not eased the affordability situation for most households, and not just because many have seen wages decrease this year either. Now, housing affordability is not an issue unique to China. It is a policy and social challenge in many countries, especially in the developed world, including my country of New Zealand. However, in China, the problem, when measured in terms of income to price ratios especially, is particularly acute. The ratio of median house prices to income surged to more than 25 at the end of 2021 in Beijing, compared with about 20 in Hong Kong. In Shenzhen, an apartment typically costs 40 times the average annual salary. According to Harvard University's Joint Center for Housing Studies, the ratios for Los Angeles and San Francisco are about 10 times. Nationally, China's median home prices to income ratio is 9.1. In the US, it's a little below 7. In an article on this very topic last week, Bloomberg analysts observed that in Shanghai, a 950 square foot two-bedroom condo sells for almost $725,000. For about the same price, a buyer could snap up a one-bedroom unit in Manhattan, where the average disposable income is more than 6 times higher. It is not unusual in major Chinese cities to see households allocating 50 to 80% of their post-tax disposable income to mortgage payments. Beijing understands the many economic and social risks associated with this housing unaffordability crisis. Part of its answer is the building of rental housing for recent graduates and others, vowing to build 6.5 million units in 40 cities by 2025. Everbright Securities Co. estimates that this will cost at least $200 billion. If possible, this could be useful. If local governments sell assets to pay for them, then it would also represent a healthy transfer from local government to households. However, this is only scratching the top of the issue. Another part of Beijing's answer was the so-called 3 red lines in 2020. That is the deleveraging campaign on developers. And as we know, this was wildly unsuccessful, and Beijing is now in the process of trying to reverse it. Tom Ehrlich, chief economist at Bloomberg Economics and author of China, the Bubble That Never Pops, says in a recent article that Chinese policymakers are between a rock and a hard place. He argues that China is trying to manage down the oversupply of homes as well as prices to bring the market in balance. Quote, "If you want to improve affordability without having a systemic crisis, you don't actually want house prices to fall. You want them to stabilize and incomes to rise. If prices fall 25% and everyone sells their houses, then you have a systemic crisis." End quote. The thing with bubbles, however, is they typically only go one of two ways. They grow or they pop. Policymakers can keep prices high for a few more years with the systemic imbalance and housing affordability issues that this entails, or they can let prices return to a healthier, more sustainable equilibrium over time, weathering the short-term pain of what could be systemic crisis and long-term slowdown, but they cannot have both. Okay, that is today's episode of China Update. Thank you so much, everybody, for watching. Have a wonderful day wherever you are, and I will see you all tomorrow.